I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the latest military updates from the front lines, discuss the results and implications of the European elections, and we speak to analyst Mykola Bielieskov on the lack of public discussion about Ukraine's future strategy, and what that strategy may look like.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 10th of June. 2 years and 108 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nicholls, Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes, and our guest is Mykola Bielieskov. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, thanks, David. Hi and hello to you, wherever you are. A lot of news, it being a Monday, so we'll take it in chronological order if we can. Let's go back to Saturday. Ukraine said it hit one of Russia's most advanced stealth fighters, the first time it's done so in a drone strike, and this one was 365 miles behind the front line. Ukraine's GUR military intelligence agency said the drone hit the airfield in Russia's Astrakhan region. That's way over by the Caspian Sea on Saturday, destroying an Su-57 fighter bomber. In a statement, military intelligence said the defeat of the Su-57 is the first such case in history. Now, photographs showed debris scattered around the Aktubinsk airfield there, and a faint outline of what appears or what used to be an Su-57 fighter bomber. Russia's thought to only have a few of them in service. I think only about, less than a dozen, but others small single digits, I think, in build at the moment. Now, the bomber, the modern Su-57, designed as a replacement for the aging MiG-29 Su-27, only been in service since 2020. Each one estimated to cost about $25 million, 2.2 billion rubles. Now then, it is supposed to be super duper stealthy and very manoeuvrable, and has been firing the Kh-59 and 69 hypersonic missiles. The Russian MOD not commented, but many of the country's military bloggers were quite outraged that the attack had got through so far into the war. Rybar, with 1.2 million subscribers on Telegram, said Russian officials hadn't been doing enough to protect Russian warplanes on their airfields. They said, for the cost of repairing one Su-57, it's possible to fully equip several operational tactical aircraft with light shelters near the front line. But despite 2 years of hostilities and frequent attacks against aircraft by drones, those in charge did not bother to do this. Quite punchy from them. Another Russian mill blogger mocked Russian officials for trying to deceive Ukraine and the any allies, with pictures of fake Su-57s painted on the tarmac. So satellites and airborne surveillance assets would look at it and think, well, that's depending on the definition. It might have worked a few years ago, but now you're getting down to the just centimetres per pixel. Some of these capabilities, it's really, really difficult just to deceive in that way. But this blogger channel said the poorly painted silhouette of the Su-57 and Aktubinsk airfield of course failed to deceive modern NATO satellites with good photographic resolution. That was the War Observer Telegram channel. Ukrainians, as you'd expect, celebrated the strike against the Su-57. Maria Avdieva, who's a Ukrainian commentator, said the strike had been a slap in the face for the Kremlin. And then defence analyst Vadim Labas said that it showed the weakness of Russia's airfield defence systems, which I think is a statement of the obvious. Quote was, the main thing about this attack is that for the second day in a row, our drones have broken through the airfield defences, Mr. Labas said. Russia lacks air defence systems to defend its airfield. Now, a brief segue. When Mr. Labas refers to a second day in a row, that it was because a few hours before this strike on the Su-57, Ukrainian drones are thought to have hit the Mozdok air base in North Ossetia, southern Russia. That's the base of the Tu-22M heavy bombers. Now, I mean, it's a long way away from Aktubinsk. It's 400 k's southwest, and we're still 500 k's east-southeast-ish of the Kerch Bridge. But it's all in the same ballpark. If you're talking that many hundreds of miles behind the lines, I think it's fairly impressive stuff for the drones, get drones over there. Anyway, Russian MOD said its forces had shot down 3 drones Ukraine's officials hadn't claimed any hits on that second strike there against the Mozdok air base. But just bringing this story up to date, yesterday, Ukraine's military intelligence spokesperson Andrei Yusov, speaking on TV, he said that a second Russian Su-57 may have been destroyed in that first strike on the Aktybinsk airfield. So basically, David, the fact that drones are getting that far away now and striking the most sophisticated assets Russia has speaks of, I think, Ukrainian technical innovation, and still this Russian inability to, I don't know what it is, to take the threat seriously, or to think that that range gives them a certain invulnerability, but not to protect these things properly, I think is quite staggering.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dom. Well, there's a few more details, I think, and stories from the weekend that we should go through first before we talk about this week. What else have you been looking at, Dom Nicholls?
Yeah, lots more. So sticking on Saturday still, Ukrainian ground forces said soldiers from their 47th Mechanized Brigade were holding back at least 3 Russian combat brigades on the Pokrovsk front. So this is the area northwest of Donetsk city, sort of a line from there up through Avdiivka, where the Russians have had limited tactical success in the last few months now, but not got very far at all. But a spokesperson for Ukrainian ground forces said, "Here the enemy is trying to advance into the depths of our territory. Soldiers of the 47th Mech Brigade are holding back at least 3 Russian combat brigades. With huge reserves of manpower, the Russians quickly replenish their huge losses and throw new soldiers into battle again and again. The fighting does not cease for a moment." Now, carrying on from there, also Saturday, UK Defence Intelligence put out their daily update on Ukraine. On Saturday, they said, and they showed actually imagery analysis. They said imagery analysis shows 8 barges on the southern side of the Kerch Bridge, which they said had been installed between May the 10th and May the 22nd of this year. British Defence Intelligence say that this is an attempt to defend the bridge and the shipping channel, reducing what they say is the angle of approach, potential angle of approach for Ukrainian maritime drones. Now, they said previously installed barriers have been rendered ineffective by storms, possibly linked, and on that, if you have a look at their Twitter feed, there's an image of the barges there, but possibly linked to that, Sky News are reporting a source who says that on Saturday evening, Ukrainian forces conducted what they say was a coordinated strike against a Russian landing ship that had been moved into the Sea of Azov from the Black Sea, possibly moved for a task that we'll speak about in a moment, or possibly moved because of the threat that we've seen from Ukrainian drones in the Black Sea. Now, this vessel was said to be a Raputia-class landing craft, said to be the 5th of 7 such class of ship to be sunk or rendered unserviceable by Ukrainian attacks. This is coming from the source speaking to Sky. Source said this successful strike shows the Russians they cannot operate with freedom either in the Black Sea or eastward. Now, Russian forces are thought to be using these ships to ferry ammunition and supplies across the Sea of Azov into the area around Mariupol for onward transit to the front line. I've been thinking about that today and looking around. I'll offer some thoughts a little bit later on what I think that means, why that is, I think, a potentially significant moment if all those building blocks are falling into place. And I accept there's quite a few ifs, buts and maybes, and we're not able to verify any of that, but I'll speak about that a bit more in final thoughts. Then, David, moving on to Sunday, Russian attacks against Dnipropetrovsk, Donetsk, Kharkiv and Kherson Oblast resulted in deaths and injuries to civilians. This comes from local authorities, including regional governors. However, Chernihiv, Luhansk, Mykolaiv, Sumy and Zaporizhia Oblast also came under attack, but no casualties reported there. Sticking with Sunday, Russia's MOD said its air defences had shot down a Ukrainian drone in Belgorod Oblast, so inside Russia, but local telegram channels, mainly of the Russian Milblog community, reported a loud explosion in the Rakityansky district in Belgorod Oblast earlier in the day. There's videos you'll find on social media of something big on fire, lots of smoke. Now, that area, it's about 40 k's due east to Sumy, 75 k's north-northwest of Kharkiv, over the border, as I say, inside Russia. According to the Astra Telegram channel, locals claimed that a Russian ammunition depot had been hit. A bit similar to before, we're not able to verify that, but the imagery on social media suggests something very large has gone up in flames. And then also it was announced, I think on Sunday, Ukrainian conscripts and reservists living abroad for more than 3 months are now able to register for military service at foreign consulates. Previously, military conscripts living abroad for more than 3 months needed to visit a registration office inside Ukraine to sort of keep up to date with their whereabouts and contact details. However, this is the latest step Ukraine's made to upgrade the sort of legal and bureaucratic framework around conscription and mobilisation, just making sure they know who's where and how they can get a hold of them. You'll remember President Zelensky signed the new law on mobilisation on April the 16th, but this is all part of their effort. Some might say it's quite slow and late, but effort to get a view on what the available resource in terms of personnel is and where everyone is, and encourage in increasingly legal terms Ukrainian, mainly men, to come back to fight.
Thank you very much, Dom. Only a few more updates from you, I think. Would you bring us up to date today? So we've covered the weekend, we've covered that strike on the Russian warplane. Bring us up to date militarily today.
Yeah, so this morning, Ukraine's General Staff, and this news is breaking as we came onto air, so I've just grabbed the latest information as I could get it, but there'll be more out shortly, I'm sure, through the day. But Ukraine's General Staff are saying that Ukrainian forces attacked Russian S-400 and S-300 anti-air missile systems in a number of areas of occupied Crimea last night. There were a series of explosions reported across the peninsula, mainly in the north and the west or northwest. It's thought two S-300, well, an S-300 and an S-400 SAM system, surface-to-air missile system, has gone up, as well as 4 radars hit. Again, I mean, these are you think they are very capable, certainly the S-400, very modern SAM systems, but why they don't have local air defence to protect them is just beyond me. It's absolutely staggering, and we've seen this before, especially in Crimea. There's no point defence for these things, which means that they are, and a lot of these attacks are filmed. This one wasn't filmed, others have been, but if there's a drone in the sky able to film these attacks, I mean, it just speaks of a very, very poor air defence system or network or skill level, really. Also today, though, Sumy region, some odd reports coming out of Sumy region. I think there's been an attempted incursion across the border from Russia. Now, let's take this step by step. Ukrainian officials denied a claim by Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov that Russian forces led by a Chechen-based unit had seized control of a border village in northeast Ukraine near Sumy. So Kadyrov said yesterday that the Akhmat Chechnya unit had spearheaded Russian troops in taking control of Rizhivka, that's in Sumy, about 40 km northwest of the city of Sumy, but only 500 metres from the border with Russia. Now, Kadyrov said, quote, a large-scale planned advance had inflicted significant losses on the Ukrainian side, which was forced to retreat. But then today, Reuters are reporting Andrei Kovalenko, who's the head of the Ukrainian government's Centre for Countering Disinformation, who said on Telegram that Russian forces had tried to test Ukraine's defences in the area, but that Ukraine is in control of the situation. Mr. Kovalenko added that the threat, however, of Russian action across the border remains. And then just a few hours ago, President Zelensky tweeted and said, Ukrainian forces are fully in control of the situation in the Sumy region. Russian sabotage groups remain active, but are being eliminated and will continue to be dealt with decisively. In the village of Rizhivka, the occupiers attempted a propaganda operation. As of this morning, the Russian flag has been destroyed and there is no enemy presence in the village, unquote. So it looks like something happened, came across the border, obviously planted the Russian flag somewhere. No doubt there'll be imagery of that going around the Russian channels now, but Ukraine seemingly pretty full-throated in their denial that the situation has not been resolved. But I think we'll probably hear more about that through the day as well, David. And I think that's probably us up to date on the military angle at least.
Absolutely. Well, I'll just press you once more because I see Joe Barnes is waiting to speak about the European elections and what it means for Ukraine. But Dom, could you take us through just a couple of important diplomatic and political updates, and then we'll go to Joe?
Yeah, 2 to be aware of. So firstly, inside Russia, a court in Moscow has ordered a French citizen who they've accused of collecting information about military matters in Russia, ordered that he be held in jail pending an investigation and trial. So this individual is Laurent Vanatier. He's an advisor with the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue. That's a Geneva-based non-governmental organisation. He was arrested in Moscow last Thursday. Of course, the backdrop to this, the context, is the increasing tension right now between Moscow and Paris after French President Emmanuel Macron's recent statements about the possibility of deploying French troops inside Ukraine and the ongoing conversation about Western-supplied weapons being used in Russia. Now, Russian authorities accuse Mr. Vanatier of failing to register as a foreign agent while collecting information about Russia's military and military technical activities. However, they did not provide any details of the accusations beyond alleging that Mr. Vanatier had repeatedly travelled to Russia to collect his information. Under Russian law, this is a criminal offence, punishable by up to 5 years, they say. Mr. Vanatier has been remanded in pre-trial detention until August the 5th. I'm afraid he may well be another pawn in the diplomatic game. It's a bit like Evan Goshkovitz, the American journalist who's still being held. And just one more, David. Mustafa Naim, who's the top Ukrainian official overseeing reconstruction and defence fortifications, has resigned, reporting today. He's claiming his agency has been systematically undermined by the government. Now, this is reporting from our colleagues at the Financial Times. Speaking to them, Mr. Naim, who's the head of the State Agency for Restoration and Infrastructure Development, he said Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal had barred Naim from participating in the annual Ukraine Recovery Conference. That's going on this week, in fact, tomorrow and Wednesday in Berlin. We're hoping to get reports out of it. But a Ukrainian government official speaking to the FT said, this is causing conniptions. Okay, so this Ukrainian government official speaking to the FT said the US and other Western partners want a normal, predictable relationship with their Ukrainian counterparts. Right now, they are losing trust in Ukraine's government because of personnel decisions that they do not understand. Right, President Zelensky is due to go to this conference in Berlin after being in France for the D-Day 80 commemorations. I was there as well, saw him on Thursday. He's in Germany at the moment. He's thought to be going to this conference in Berlin. But a Ukraine government spokesperson said that Naim had been barred from going as well, as he's scheduled to give an update on his agency's work on Wednesday. So it sounds as if there's some internal government bit of a bish-bosh going on, but if it starts, and that's fine, that happens all the time, but if it starts to dent Western or external supporters' confidence, then that's obviously not a good thing. So this could be a bit more serious than just shuffling a few people around. And just finally, sticking with the Financial Times, in the form of their Kyiv correspondent Christopher Miller, he's also saying today that Ukraine is going to begin testing its own guided aerial bombs, i.e. the glide bombs that we've been speaking about that Russia have been using to such effect in recent months. Ukraine going to be testing their own one in the next few weeks. So Christopher says that was confirmed today by Sergei Olybsev, who's the chief of aviation of Ukraine's Air Force. And I suppose we better let Joe have a word in Edgeways, David.
Absolutely. Well, sterling job, Dom. Thank you so much. Good to have you back from your reporting in France for the D-Day anniversary. Listeners may, of course, want to see some of Dom's reporting, so do go to the Telegraph website, find his profile page there and have a read. Joe Barnes, thank you so much for joining us. Some fairly seismic results in the European elections over the weekend. Can you talk us through what happened and just tell us a little bit about what you think this means for support for Ukraine? Joe Barnes.
Yeah, so interesting results. The far right, hard right, populist, nationalists, whatever we want to call them, have made record gains. They've got a record number of seats, which is interesting. I'll drill down into two of the countries concerned. Ursula von der Leyen, though, still looks to have a pro-European Union majority in the European Parliament, so it boosts her hopes of getting a second term as the European Commission president. But I think what the two seismic results, the main one being in France, Emmanuel Macron's Renaissance Party lost to Marine Le Pen's far-right National Rally. So it's about 32 seats to 15 in favour of the far-right party. And that instantly prompted Emmanuel Macron to hold parliamentary elections. So why I'm sure he's probably confident that he can see off the far right at home. There is a prospect that France could have a far right prime minister when the votes are counted. And this is a two-step stage. So they will vote in the end of June and then in July. But why is it interesting? So Marine Le Pen, maybe she's shifting on Ukraine because she stood up and applauded Zelensky the other day. But actually, if we look at sort of her rhetoric and things she's done in the past, she's been photographed with Vladimir Putin. Her party doesn't really support aid to Ukraine because it sort of says that makes you a party to the war, stuff like that. So that's not particularly good news. And then in Germany, while the centrist or centre-right EPP party, so the CDU, the Christian Democrats, won about 30% of the vote, Olaf Scholz's coalition took a thumping. His Socialist Party finished in third, and the Greens, who are also part of his traffic light coalition, finished in fourth with losing 8 or 9 percentage points on what they recorded in 2019. And that leaves the far-right AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, in second place there, and they're known as one of the largest far-right parties that are close to pro-Putin far-right parties in Europe. So while on the face of it, I don't think that this is majorly going to change how Europe, how Germany, how France gives aid and support to Ukraine, but it will put pressure on them. But also what it's done is it's enabled Russia to come in gloating. So some quotes here. So Dmitry Peskov, who's the Kremlin spokesman, he said, despite the fact that so far pro-European parties retain their leading position, with time, right-wing parties will be snapping at their heels. And then the head of Russia's State Duma, and he is Vyacheslav Volodin, he wrote on Telegram that Macron and Scholz are clinging on to power with their last remaining strength. The right thing for them to do would be to resign and stop making a mockery of their citizens. So it's just allowing Moscow, the Kremlin, Putin's allies to stick the knife in a little bit and help divide the populations at home. So another guy who is a former Kremlin advisor known as Markov, he said, I hope Macron understands that the French are rejecting him for fanning the war against Russia in Ukraine, but maybe he will instead choose escalation and launch a NATO war with Russia. So look, it's the same talking points that they're leaning to, but it's just an opportunity for Russia to dig in. And actually, Ursula von der Leyen was quite interesting last night, and when sort of discussing the far-right, hard-right game, she was leaning to and pointing to outside forces, basically a thinly veiled stab at Russia for stoking tensions that have opened the door to these far-right parties. And I'll stop there for now.
Well, thank you so much, Joe, for joining us. Joe, just very quickly, in a couple of sentences, what's your takeaways from this? What should our listeners who aren't familiar, maybe those in the US and the UK, what should we be taking from this?
So I think the immediate thing to look for is in the next few weeks, could be months, depends on how long it takes for the Parliament to launch it, but is to look whether there is a majority for Ursula von der Leyen to become European Commission President. She is all important when it comes to Ukraine support from the EU. She has really driven that from a high level. She's made it one of her flagship policies. So, yeah, watch out. Make sure that Ursula von der Leyen has a majority, because that will be important going forward. Because if she suddenly loses a majority, that calls into question her main policies, which are Ukraine, the European Green Deal, so basically sort of climate change combating actions. So, yeah, if she has to tilt to the right, she's going to start maybe losing some of that support. But one of her main allies on the right has emerged as Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, who is very resolute in her support for Ukraine. So that's also worth looking at. So I don't think it's a massive blow for Ukraine, more at home in the likes of Germany and France, where their ruling governments are now being called into question, and our European-wide elections have been used by their populist opposition to beat down on the governments there.
Thank you, Dom and Joe. It's a subject we've mentioned a few times on this podcast, the comparative lack of a public discussion around Ukraine's future strategy and what that strategy might look like. Earlier, I spoke to analyst Mykola Bielieskov about how this situation arose and the possible ways ahead. Here's our conversation. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Mykola. Thank you so much for coming into the office as well. It's really good to meet you. Would you start just by introducing yourself and your work to our audience?
Hi, and thanks for the invitation and hosting me. My name is Mykola Bielieskov. I'm a Ukrainian citizen, which has two affiliations. One is governmental one, and other non-governmental one. So governmental one, I'm a research fellow at the National Institute for Strategic Studies. It's a think tank created in 1992 when Ukraine reestablished its independence. I'm at the Department of Defense Policy, and the goal of this think tank is to advise the President of Ukraine, National Security and Defense Council in diverse fields of governance. We are charities that is aiding armed forces of Ukraine. So our name is Come Back Alive. So I'm representing also the biggest non-governmental charity, which is aiding armed forces of Ukraine. So we are collecting money, raising funds, and provide different kinds of both force multipliers and weaponry to ensure that our troops come back alive. Since 21st of February 2022, we raised more than $250 million and procured different stuff that is essential for modern combat.
Mykola, thank you for that introduction. We're going to talk about some ideas you've put down in an article for Euromaidan Press. We'll put that in the show notes so listeners can read that as well. You write, in the aftermath of the Ukrainian summer 2023 offensive, which failed to yield the desired results, despite the firm dedication of the Ukrainian army, there has been virtually no public discussion about Ukraine's future optimal strategy in the war against Russia. Let's start there. Why do you think there's been no public discussion about the future strategy?
Because people, both inside Ukraine and outside, they pinned too much hope to this offensive attempt. I recall a number of meetings I was in US back in May 2023, and one of my major points I raised in every single meeting with different think tanks experts, so what's next? And when I asked this issue, what's next, no matter the result of the offensive, so was it successful or not, and I didn't have any proper response. So there was a conceptual void, and too much hopes were pinned on these offensive attempts. And that's a very dangerous situation, believe me, because when people don't have a sense of direction, sense of purpose, they're easily manipulated. And it's true both for people inside Ukraine and people outside Ukraine. And you already referred to this article, and I should note it was written first and foremost for Ukrainian domestic consumption. And then it was only translated to demonstrate that we have this kind of scenes debated in Ukraine. So in Ukraine also people want to understand how we should arrange all the scenes optimally, because as I usually say, strategy is art of possible. So you can do certain scenes within limits of possible. If you strive to do things that is above your capabilities, you actually have directly opposite results. So that was unfortunately my feeling before the offensive, and unfortunately there is a situation we are now, and our partners, predominantly US as a major backer of Ukraine, still didn't manage to provide a kind of strategic blueprint. That's why you've seen the Congress, when it's both green-lighted this aid package for Ukraine, they also said within 45 days you should provide a strategic blueprint, because otherwise it's only crisis management. Crisis management, it means that it's first give initiative to your opponent, and usually the way it's done, you respond to something negative, and that's it. And that's a problem, because taxpayers here in UK, in US, in other European, Western countries, they want to have result to the funds they dedicate. And if there is no result, for sure, people start to lose interest, and that's a problem.
So why do you think, within and without Ukraine, people didn't want to think about what comes next? We've talked about this on the podcast a lot, but why not? Was it because maybe it was a difficult conversation to have, because it would involve making difficult choices? What's your analysis?
Well, I think the major problem is that we are living in such a period when people have very short attention span. And for sure, when you start to say that, well, this war is going to last for some time, for a couple of years more, it means that it's difficult to sell Ukrainian case, basically. So I think that's the problem, that especially, as one key professor said, attrition warfare, it's a very bad word. It's not sold easily. So people won't have quick results, and everything was pinned in that particular offensive, and it didn't deliver, unfortunately. And then there is this void, and it requires some courage, and it requires some standing and readiness to say the things that are not welcomed, both inside and outside Ukraine, because again, it's really a difficult scene to engage people's interests a long period of time. So that's the problem as for me. So that's a other side of having democratic countries with diverse set of problems and with short attention span.
Well, let's get into it. Your article and your thinking explores what this grand strategy for Ukraine might look like. Where do you start thinking about that? What are the challenges? What are the nuances we should be aware of?
Well, as I say, the major challenge for Ukraine is to sustain two consensuses. Consensus inside Ukraine, both these consensuses, they were settled during spring 2022, after Ukraine rebuffed this blitzkrieg attempt by Russia. So the first challenge is to have this consensus inside Ukraine preserved, that we need to fight. We need to fight smartly, for sure, and I describe how it should be done. And the other challenge is to sustain this consensus outside Ukraine, because again, I recall one meeting, it was during autumn 2022. It was The Economist journalist, and I said to him that if Ukraine is not able to produce results in the next half a year, positive results like liberating more territories and others, it would be very difficult to sustain attention. That these two consensuses, they should be preserved, and by the way, they're mutually reinforcing. So if Ukrainians are ready to fight, for sure, they should be aided. And if there is aid, Ukrainians are ready to keep fighting. And there was this positive dynamic, so as I described. On the other side, if there is lack of weaponry, for sure, readiness to fight might decrease, and vice versa. If there is lack of readiness to fight, who is going to aid Ukraine? So that's this balancing done by Zelensky, actually. He's doing this kind of shuttle diplomacy between Ukrainian society and the foreign audiences. And another problem, by the way, his arguments are not working the way they worked in 2022, and that's a problem. So we need to repackage the arguments, and that's also a problem. So I don't envy Zelensky, because he first and foremost has this power of persuasion and this shuttle diplomacy to be done and this balance to be kept, and that's how it should be organized.
So do you think that, going back to your point about, it's difficult to sell the idea of a war of attrition because it means a lot of money, a lot of time, and it's very, very creeping. You don't get big, flashy, exciting results. Do you think that's something that Zelensky in his messaging suffers from? That we hear the same thing because, of course, it is the same thing. It is a war of attrition.
Yeah, that's a problem facing him, and there is no silver bullet is a solution. That's why, again, it was autumn 2023 after the Ukrainian offensive, and in different meetings I said one thing: we need to redefine the measurement of success. And under these conditions, as for me, success is that Ukraine is defending itself, Ukraine is retreating the Russians, Ukraine is able to do a massive successful strikes, both in temporary-occupied Crimea and targeting Russian military infrastructure in Russia proper. And that's how people should perceive. And again, people, indeed, they shouldn't take for granted the fact that it's a third year of such a war, and Ukraine is fighting. It controls 80% of its function as a state. And that's quite an achievement, because you can look at the examples of World War I. It takes only 2 years of such an intense fighting for some empires of Eastern Europe start to crumble. First Russian Empire, then Austro-Hungarian Empire was on precipice, and others. So the strain is great, and the very fact that Ukraine continue to function, continue to fight, people understand that they need fighting, engage assistance, it should be taken as a great success. For sure, we need to liberate territories in the end, if our ultimate goal is declared. But in the meantime, the very fact that we are fighting is successes for me, along with striking valuable Russian pieces of equipment.
So when we think about a possible grand strategy for Ukraine in the months and in the years ahead, obviously a lot of that is dependent on the dynamics on the battlefield itself, the 20, 30 kilometres of no man's land, of frontline trenches. Could you give us your analysis and your sense of what those dynamics are in June 2024 and what especially Ukraine's allies should be aware of how the war is being fought?
That's a good example when you should do a comprehensive analysis that is about different levels of war, starting from tactics and up to the strategic level. And what we can say is that defensive mode in this war is prevalent. For sure, it's not prevalent automatically, so it should be aided. Otherwise, as we've seen, Russians were able to push us out of Avdiivka and then, again, create this bulge to the northwest of Avdiivka. But in general, if defense is properly aided, then the defensive mode is prevalent. So given the technologies at hand, it's much more easier to find the concentration of enemy grouping of forces and to create your own concentration of forces and do an offensive action. So in this case, if Ukraine need to pursue defense, this defensive mode is favoring Ukraine. People, they disregard this lesson of 2022. So first Ukraine skillfully treated Russians, and then when they face a deficit of manpower, acute one, we do two counteroffensives. So on a tactical level, defensive mode is prevalent. It's prevalent because there is ubiquity, proliferation of sensors, plus means of destruction. So both sides, they possess this, as Russians say, it's a Russian term, reconnaissance strikes, reconnaissance fire complexes. And that's quite an interesting situation and irony, because we see a lot of employment of UAVs. It's a novel scene, but on an operational level, front line is not moving. And yes, it recalls the events of Western Front in World War I. when front line was not moving. It was challenging both for the Germans and also for the French and UK troops to move forward for very the same facts. So maybe reconnaissance was not as developed, but ubiquity of means of destruction and need to devise new tactics. And actually it was a major idea of Zaluzhny article for The Economist in November 2023. He described why it happened, why it's so challenging to do an offensive action. In 2022, this dynamics worked for Ukraine. In 2023, it worked for Russia when Ukrainians needed to liberate territory. So taking into account both developments on a tactical level and the operational art, it's wise for Ukraine to treat Russians as they try to advance. Because Russians, they still forced to try to advance. They declared that Donetsk region is part of Russia. So that's how Ukraine should do it. It should exploit the nuances of this war, the technologies both sides possess to its advantage, and exploit the fact that Russian military leadership, it still didn't reconcile with the fact that trying to advance is beyond both the capability and the combat proficiency of Russian troops. That's what we did basically in 2022.
To what extent do you think that is dependent on Ukraine's partners and allies supplying Ukraine with the ammunition needed, the weapons needed? Is that dependent on that? I mean, as we've seen in the last few months, a steady loss of villages in Donetsk region. We've seen the push in Kharkiv, which of course has stopped by now, but some have linked that to the arrival of lots of Western aid. I mean, how important is that aid, do you think?
That commitment is critical. Let's be honest, no country except US can wage war on its own. So let's imagine another country of Europe in NATO face the same kind of contingency. It won't be able to, on its own, to defend these territories. So that requires a proper level of commitment. People understand the risk of hypothetical Ukrainian failure. Let's imagine this very negative hypothetical scenario. So Russians would be able to swell their ranks, relying on those who they capture, the way they did, by the way, in the Donetsk region, in Luhansk region, and then might threaten in other countries, in this case NATO countries, and then UK, US and other countries would face the choice actually how to respond. Right now you can just give Ukraine weaponry and Ukraine can fight. And the other problem is a problem of credibility. So the level of resources already committed to Ukraine, it means that under the hypothetical scenario of Ukrainian failure, it would be perceived not as a failure of Ukraine. It would be perceived as the failure of this Ramstein partnership model done mostly by the NATO countries. So that's why people need to accept this reality. And there was one beautiful argument that this package of assistance adopted by the US, it's just one day of functioning of the federal government of US. Just one day of work means Ukraine is able to decimate Russians continuously and ensure that their stock of Soviet weaponry is depleted fully. And they need to have, I don't know how many years to recover. So yes, they managed to quickly swell ranks. Now Russians have more troops. But in terms of hardware, they face a real difficulty of building brand new main battle tanks. If you look on the battlefield of statistics, it's predominantly either refurbished T-72 or even T-62 or T-54, T-55. It's not like T-90 main battle tank. So for all these reasons, it's much cheaper and more risk-free to aid Ukraine's self-defense instead of facing another level of problems if Russia is able to dominate Ukraine. By the way, just for people to understand, it already happened in the 20th century. So first, Russia subjugated Ukraine in 1920. Then they mobilized people from Ukraine and used it as an instrument to spread imperialism further, so to threaten Finland, to subjugate Baltic states, to subjugate Central and Eastern Europe. So my father, he served in Eastern Germany in 1970s. So we do not want to be part of this Russian imperial project, but if we fail, we won't have this choice. For sure, some people might flee, but we already have this experience when people were mobilized from temporary-occupied territories. So let's see the lessons of the past and prevent this kind of sin. So in this case, that's a great fortune for all people, free-loving people, to have Ukraine on a proper side of barricades.
You write up and explain some of the challenges within and for Ukraine, for the Ukrainian leadership, and it'd be good, I think, to talk a little bit about them. There's three I've got written down here. One is they must reframe success. One is maintain the minimalist consensus of allies, and also a new social contract for mobilization. Could we take each of those in turn? What do you mean by reframe success, and why do they need to do it?
Well, when people have in mind the measurement of success when fighting wars, they usually have the measurement of success of so-called annihilation strategies. There are two kinds of strategies from the point of view of series. There is annihilation strategy, which means quick destruction of your enemy forces and occupation of your territories and basically forcing your will. And there is another strategy. It's usually adopted not so voluntary, but because of the conditions, called attrition strategies. And not taking control of the territories quickly is the most important thing, but being able to defend your positions plus preserving social cohesion. Again, people need to look at World War I. Very ambitious attempts to advance without proper conditions, as it was in 1915, 1916, 1917, they produced the opposite results. Actually, after 1917 attempt to advance, French army was on a precipice of revolt, so-called Nivelle revolts. So we should redefine what is success. It means that you decimate your enemy at a rate that is favorable to you, both in terms of manpower and equipment. You preserve your own manpower. Basically, you also train some reserves. Plus, you fight in such a way not to undermine social cohesion and unity inside the country. And again, thanks we are living in different world. It's not like World War I when there was this clear division between front line and the rear. Now, means of destruction make it possible to inflict a damage deep inside your opponent territories. And that's why what we currently do is destroying Russian military infrastructure in temporary-occupied Crimea to make it vulnerable to further strikes. We also attacks ability to generate and sustain and employ grouping of forces both in large measure and in more restrained measure. In large measure, I mean attacks that target oil processing, and the oil is a source of revenue for Russia. In more stricter way, like military-industrial complex and all other things. So that's how we should proceed. It's a great pity that it took so much time, so much effort, and unfortunately so much loss out of Ukraine to people basically to recall the lessons of World War I. That's, I would say, a great failure, intellectual one, both inside Ukraine and outside Ukraine, because there is a lot of brilliant people outside Ukraine, analysts, but it took them only Ukrainian offensive, which didn't deliver results expected, to say, yeah, we should be more circumspect, we should learn from World War I, we should be very careful for some time not to assign such maximalist annihilation strategy goals, while exploiting basically Russian attempts to pursue these goals. So that's what I mean by need to redefine what is success under current conditions.
When you talk about the idea of the war of attrition, so much of that will be dependent on generating manpower for the army. And I think that goes into your third point, actually. Let's go to there now. This idea of a new social contract for mobilisation. I mean, one of my colleagues said there's lots the West can do for Ukraine. They can send ammunition, they can send weapons, they can train, they can advise. What they can't do is find more Ukrainians to fight in the front lines. And is that what you mean when a new social contract for mobilisation? I'd be interested in your thoughts as to what do you think is going right at the moment, what do you think is going wrong, and what needs to change?
Well, mobilization is a very difficult issue to solve for a number of reasons. We can discuss different angles, different dimensions of this problem, but I would like to emphasize just one thing. So we have a conflict between two things. The one is need to fight and to have men who join ranks, and fighting means either threat to die or get wounded. And on the other side, there is this 20th century consensus that human-centric approach is most important thing. So persons' comfort, security, rights, they are most important. And that's a problem, that's a challenge for Ukrainian government. So yes, we have people who voluntarily joined ranks in the first year of the war, but this rank is depleted. And by the way, it's precisely what happened during World War I. So people voluntarily joined ranks in the first year of the war, and then they seen that modern battlefield is so lethal that it's really, really challenging. And now we have this conflict. And by this, I mean that we need to somehow rebalance this relationship. So yes, there is human-centric approach, very valuable thing. We also benefit out of it, and countries in Europe, in North America benefit out of it. But then there is direct conflict with need to fight. So there should be rebalancing. And by the way, as you see, even during nominally peacetime conditions, so war still didn't affect NATO countries directly, there is a problem for most of the NATO militaries to have this proper amount of people to meet the peacetime requirement. So that's a problem. It's more important to have Ukraine being aided instead of Western countries facing these problems. But in the end, you are absolutely right that there is a certain limit beyond which we can't mobilize. And there is a problem that people apply the logic of the first half of the 20th century with different demographics. Back at that time, when women gave a birth to 3-4 children, and even after World War I, World War II, the population of Western countries it increased despite the losses. Now, Ukrainian women is given birth to less than one child. Fertility rate is 0.8, 0.9. And we need to engage more young people to make the median age younger. Before the war, the median age of male population in Ukraine was 38 years. So it means that if we even engage all of Ukrainians age 18-25, for instance, it doesn't make that much difference. So yes, we need to start this debate that there might be a situation eventually when in this or that capacity Western militaries need to appear in Ukraine. And that's the reason why Macron initiative was so welcomed in Ukraine. For sure, we understand that Macron is pursuing French national interest as he deemed proper, so it's a very good opportunity to be a leader, so-called. But in meantime, he's raising ideas that are, yes, now controversial, but in the end, they might aid in pushing the consensus. And, again, it was in 2022, maybe 2023, when this model of here's your weaponry, Ukraine, combined with your own manpower might have worked. And unfortunately, that opportunity was lost. We can discuss for hours why it was lost. But for all the factors I described to you, there might be development that would force NATO countries to intervene in this or that way because of the different demographics. And that's the thing, because as for me, a lot of people, they don't have this context, nuances to understand. In the meantime, yes, we should increase the ranks, we should engage more people, and I can provide specifics, unfortunately, but I can say you that now at least we can compensate for the losses. So we can have the same grouping of forces retained. We don't have maybe this luxury the Russians have of slowly increasing our grouping of forces, but at least we can compensate for losses and have the same grouping of forces and pursuing defensive mode of action. It means that that's more or less enough for Ukraine. And the last scene, ultimately, if we recall World War I, I think it's the scenes that should be kept in mind, that in the end, only better firepower and better tactics is a solution to the problems Ukraine face.
Just staying on that very quickly, in terms of policy then, do you think there's any obvious or maybe not obvious policy changes or innovations that the Ukrainian government could make to help it solve that manpower problem and to create this new social contract for mobilization?
Both the scenes are very difficult for a number of things. So people understand how it should be done in theory, but in practice there is no one single solution. So it should be better training. And by the way, we see a number of brigades, they do the training on their own. So basically do this recruitment of their own. And it also makes me a little bit optimistic. So yes, maybe the whole government recruitment system is not working, but recruitment done by different brigades, it's working. It's engaged people. So there is no one solution. And in the meantime, we should be very careful, because if we apply authoritarian methods, it would backfire. And again, we are democracy, and in democracy you can't just force people to do this kind of thing. So it should be done, improve training, at least a little bit decently, improve command and control. And these are two things that Western countries can be valuable, instrumental in both training our officers, because it's not only about basic skills, how to fight, it's also about officers training. It's about operational art, by the way. Neither Ukrainian nor Western countries have this kind of proficiency. So operational art atrophied, how to orchestrate all the instruments of military power, different branches, to have the results at the operational level of war. So that's a challenge we can both address, actually, because people who are now 4-star generals, they were maybe first, second lieutenants when the last large-scale operation was done, and it's Desert Storm of 1991 by Western countries.
So just to finish then, what do you think that policymakers and the public around the world should know about some of the nuances maybe that they wouldn't get not being in Ukraine and not being so familiar necessarily with Ukrainian society? What should they know about the way the war's going, the challenges Ukraine is facing, that will help them in their decisions and their thinking about Ukraine?
As for me, in the end, everything depends on the level of commitment out of Western countries, because our own resource base is quite limited one. It's only $160 billion GDP already subsidized to a certain extent. So it's a commitment out of the Western countries, proper one. that would make a difference. And the stakes are high, as for me, because we just recently recalled the events of D-Day 80 years ago. So 80 years ago, the frontier of freedom was just on the beaches of Normandy. Now the frontier of freedom in Europe in the steppes of Donbass and southern Ukraine. And as for me, progress is quite good one in the last 80 years. The only thing is that, it requires some commitment. Unfortunately, both politicians and ordinary people, they treat usually the situation from the point of view, what is the price of action? What is the risk of action? Indeed, pursuing even defensive strategy I described, it's not cost-free. But believe me, the price of inaction will be a bigger one. And this is precisely the thing that you should learn out of Ukraine. Maybe you forget your own lessons during the interwar period. But Ukraine actually demonstrates this kind of things, because we also have this debate as to what extent the defense field should be financed before big war and all other things. So in the end, price of inaction would be a bigger one. And the next time, if Ukraine fail, and if Russia attacks Baltic states that are quite vulnerable from the military point of view, they don't have this strategic rear. And then, under this scenario, there would be a real contingency, and choices would be much more difficult ones. So that's the thing that should be kept in mind by both politicians and ordinary people, that usually price of inaction, when there is a revisionist state or a bunch of revisionist states, is usually bigger, ultimately, than the price of action.
Mykola, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for the invitation.
The Telegraph's foreign correspondent Ben Farmer has been out in the east of Ukraine, reporting from Kharkiv and surrounding towns. We caught up on Friday, and he told us what he's seen and where he's been.
It's now 4 weeks since Kharkiv, Ukraine's second city, once again found itself at the centre of a Russian offensive. This city of about 1.4 million people close to the Russian border in the northeast of the country has really, as much as anywhere, seen the ebb and flow of this war in the last 2.5 years. Russian troops got to the outskirts of the city in February 2022 and then were beaten back later in the year. The city was starting to get back on its feet after that push, which had caused a lot of damage to the surrounding region. And then on May the 10th, we saw this other offensive, troops again coming across the border. Now, 4 weeks after that offensive, it looks like it hasn't really got that far over the border. Maybe about 6 miles maximum is the distance Russian troops have made it. But what has happened is there's been a dramatic increase, or there had been until recently, of airstrikes on Kharkiv. Spending time in the city this week, I'd say the mood is not panicked, but it is subdued. The streets are not empty, but they're quiet. A lot of businesses are closed, but life is going on. To the extent, even strangely, that in some of the hotels we've seen a few hardy holidaymakers. But the mood has changed in the last week. Officials say what has made the difference is the authorization for Ukraine to launch cross-border strikes with Western-supplied weapons. Yesterday I spoke to both the mayor and the governor, and they both said that that authorization to use those weapons and the first strikes we've seen in the Belgorod region had almost immediately started to relieve pressure on the city. The big threat to the city has been the use of S-300, S-400 systems, which originally are Russian air defense systems, but Russia has been using them to strike ground targets. And these have been the big weapon that have been threatening Kharkiv in the last month. We saw some of those systems reportedly destroyed by HIMARS strikes in the past week, and both the mayor and the governor thought that that had had an immediate effect in making Kharkiv safer. In the city, there are still regular air raids. Sirens ring out across the city, and also everyone gets emergency phone alerts, which ring out. You'll be in a restaurant or in a crowded room, and everyone's phone will start chiming at the same time to say there is a suspected air attack coming in. But in the last 5 or 6 days, the attacks, though there have been warnings, they haven't actually been hitting the city. While we've been here, we've also been talking to troops who are fighting on the Volchansk front. Volchansk is the city just inside the Russian border, which has seen the brunt of the fighting. The city, which has a population of about 20,000 people, in peacetime has been largely destroyed by the fighting. By some estimates, 80% of the buildings have been damaged. But speaking to soldiers on that front, they say that the front has stabilized. They are still under heavy bombardment from the Russians. The Russians still do have a great advantage and superiority in terms of artillery, but they say that the front has stabilized to some extent.
Coming up, Dom and Joe's final thoughts. Let's move to our final thoughts then. Dom Nicholls, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thanks, David. So back to the bit I mentioned in news today. Today's British Defence Intelligence update showing imagery of 8 barges on the southern side of the Kerch Bridge, which they say they analyse is there to defend the bridge and the channel there. Put that with this alleged attack inside the Sea of Azov against a Russian landing craft by, we presume maritime drone. And I'm afraid there's more ifs, buts and maybes in this section as well, because we just can't verify any of this. But if there's something that's been hit, damaged, sunk, almost doesn't matter really in terms of the strategic effects. But I think this could be quite significant. So just for a bit of geography, so the Sea of Azov is that bit of the Black Sea right in the top northeast corner. You get into it by going through the Kerch Strait, over which the Kerch Bridge now goes. But the Sea of Azov, it's not a lake, of course. It's joined to the Black Sea. But at the moment, it's bordered by Russia and Russian-occupied territory. You've got Crimea to the kind of southwest. You've got Russia to the southeast and the east and the northeast. And then you've got Ukraine to the north and the northwest, currently occupied Ukraine to the north and the northwest. So what I'm saying is that Ukrainian forces, they can't get there without getting their feet wet, basically, to put it bluntly. So if something has got inside the Sea of Azov, chances are it hasn't gone over land and then been plopped in off a jetty at midnight, right? It's got in there through the only route that's possible, which is underneath the Kerch Bridge. So if a drone has got in there in order to hit a Raputia-class landing ship, I think it shows, firstly, that Ukrainian forces can get past these defences on the Kerch Bridge, these barges and whatever else they've got there. And secondly, it shows that Ukrainian forces have more than likely chosen not to attack the bridge, but to go for the ships. Now, if that's because Ukraine views Russian logistic lines across the Sea of Azov into Mariupol and elsewhere along the coast to push ammunition and other supplies forward as a safer way of doing it than trying to go into Crimea and then north over the bridge, then that reinforces this potential idea that Russia views Crimea as a strategic risk at the moment, i.e. we know it's in range, it keeps getting hit, it seemingly can't defend itself. So if you put a lot of your materiel, Russia, if you put a lot of your material into Crimea, then it runs a risk, very real risk, of being hit. So maybe that's why they're using ships now across the very short little bit of waterway from Russia to occupied Ukraine, Mariupol area, across the Sea of Azov. So if Ukraine is now hitting that, then, I mean, it really does show that the Russian Black Sea Fleet has got nowhere to go. They're being hit in Novorossiysk now. If they're now inside, Ukraine is inside the Sea of Azov and hitting ships there, I think that is very significant. And especially if it means that they have chosen not to hit the bridge, if by expending your planning time and expending your valuable resource and drones and all the rest of it by trying to take down the bridge, if they're saying, well, actually, it's no longer such a strategically gripping problem for us and we can ignore it and go inside the Sea of Azov and go for the shipping, that I think is a very, very significant moment. We will really see in the next few weeks how significant these attacks have been on Crimea, because we're about to go into the summer tourist season, of course. And if there's no confidence from Russian people to go on holiday in Crimea because of all this news, then that really does start to ask the question, well, has Ukraine denied Crimea to Russia, and therefore what that may mean in terms of the whole shtick about Putin making the bringing back the empire, and Crimea is the jewel in the crown, and if they don't own it, or without even saying it, but demonstrably don't own it because people don't want to go there and they're trying to prioritise other routes, then that is a very, very significant moment.
Thank you very much, Dom Nicholls. Joe Barnes, would you like the very final words?
So I promised you I'd speak about the Mirage 2000-5 model that France has offered to send and prepare for Ukraine. And just a few things mentioned that while it's sort of a great aircraft, highly suited, it's been very successful with France and other countries that have bought it and operate it in their air force, it does pose sort of Ukraine with a few issues, not particularly bad ones. They're sort of nice problems to have, but there are issues that sort of we need to be aware of. And I spoke to Justin Bronk, the air power guru expert at RUSI last week, and he helped me write a piece. So first of all, I think we have to say that we've seen with the F-16 that Ukraine is struggling and it's taking up a lot of resource from Ukraine and multiple countries to get into place the infrastructure and the logistical chains and supply chains that is needed to operate an F-16. Mirage is going to be no different to that. So establishing suitable air bases, making sure they're defended by air defence. Are they going to be underground bunkers? We've seen some reporting recently that Ukraine are going to look to store some of their F-16s out of the country when they're not in use. So that's another aircraft that you've got to think of, plus different kind of maintenance systems and stuff like that. People trained up on them. So Justin Bronk seemed to have this to say. He said it's probably not worth all the personnel and huge resources that it will take to develop a Ukrainian Mirage capability, get it up and running and defend it in Ukraine. Then what else is problematic? So while it's capable of firing the Storm Shadow missile, it will most likely be used by Ukraine to fire the Mika air-to-air missile, which Justin says is by no means a bad missile. It's fairly agile. It can be pretty unpleasant to defend against if you're inside the so-called no escape zone, but it is fundamentally significantly shorter ranged than the AMRAAM, which will be supplied on the F-16. And so ultimately what we've got to remember is that Ukrainian jets, because of the dense Russian air defense sort of coverage around the border region, have got to fly very low. So using the terrain to mask their routes. They're under the deck, I think it's called. Dom, you might be able to correct me on that, of these air defense. But that means that there's denser air, so they're not flying as fast, which means the missiles aren't going to have as much range. So again, what is already a shorter range weapon with the Mika is going to be even shorter now. And basically Justin said, look, flying low is a really significant limiting factor for how much utility they can get in the crucial air defense task, which any fighter is primarily needed. The jets could be used to intercept sort of cruise missiles or Shahed type drones inside Ukraine, but that's really a really expensive way of doing it. So yeah, it's food for thought as Macron, the French president, announces what is no doubt a really helpful and welcome package of support, but there are lots of challenges that we still haven't overcome with the S-16 program. So adding Mirage to that could only complicate matters for now.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Rachel Porter, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.